In the previous video, we discussed the structure of argument, how to distinguish premises from conclusions, and how to put an argument into standard form. These are all important skills. However, philosophers are not just concerned with understanding the structure of a piece of reasoning. Philosophers are really interested in determining whether some piece of reasoning constitutes a good argument or a bad argument. After all, logic itself is the study of the difference between good and bad reasoning, or the difference between good and bad arguments. So, how do we tell the difference? In this video, we will explore how to evaluate whether some argument reasons well or whether it reasons poorly. As we will see, there are two different standards we use when making this evaluation. First, we ask whether the argument has the proper underlying logical structure. In doing so, we determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. Second, we determine whether the premises of the argument provide reliable evidence. In doing so, we determine whether the argument is sound or unsound. The ability to effectively answer both of these questions will be crucial for understanding and analyzing the philosophical arguments that you will encounter later in this class. When evaluating an argument, there are two questions that we need to ask. The first I will call the inferential question, and the second I will call the evidential question. As its name suggests, the inferential question has to do with the inference made by the argument or the underlying logical structure of the argument. When we ask the inferential question, we are asking, do the premises support the conclusion? Or if all the premises are true, then do we have a good reason to think the conclusion is true? The critical thing to notice about the inferential question is this. When we ask this question, we are not asking whether the premises that the argument presents are actually true. At present, that is not our concern. Rather, we are asking the following. If we were to assume that those premises are true, then would we have a good reason to think that the conclusion of the argument is correct? Again, we are not asking whether the premises really are true. We are simply asking whether those premises, as stated, provide sufficient support for the conclusion that the argument is attempting to draw. Is the argument making a good inference or a faulty inference? Now, when does our concern turn toward whether the premises really are true? Well, our concern turns in this direction when we ask the evidential question, which, again, as suggested by its name, deals with the evidence used by the argument. Here we ask, are the premises true? Is the evidence used by the argument correct and reliable? It is at this point that we move beyond the merely structural concern of the inferential question. Now we are not merely asking whether the premises would support the conclusion if they were true. Now we are asking, are these premises really true? Are they really reliable? Do we have a good reason to think that these premises are correct? At the moment, the explanation given of the difference between the inferential question and the evidential question is somewhat abstract. Let's make it more concrete by looking at a specific example. Suppose an individual named Sleazy Sally wanted to sell you the car pictured currently on your screen. Take a good look at this picture, because doing so will be necessary to evaluate Sleazy Sally's argument. Now, in order to convince you that you should buy this car that is pictured on your screen, Sleazy Sally gives you the following argument. Premise 1. It is a good decision to purchase cars that run great, get great gas mileage, have the latest safety features, and are reasonably priced. P2. Sleazy Sally's car does run great, it gets great gas mileage, and has the latest safety features, and is reasonably priced. Conclusion, it is a good decision to purchase Sleazy Sally's car. So, is this a good argument? To determine this, we need to answer both the inferential question and the evidential question. Let's begin with the inferential question. As explained previously, when asking this question, we first assume that all the premises are true. So, we assume it is true that Sleazy Sally's car has all the characteristics described in P2. It runs great, gets great gas mileage, etc. And we assume, as stated in P1, that it is a good idea to buy cars with those characteristics. Now, given those two assumptions, do we have good reason to think that the conclusion is true? That it would be a good idea to purchase Sleazy Sally's car? I think so. If it is a good decision to buy cars that have all the characteristics that Sleazy Sally's car is claimed to have in the second premise, then it would be a good decision to buy Sleazy Sally's car. Taken together, both of the premises imply that we have good reason to think the conclusion is true. Now, what does this mean exactly? It means that the underlying inference or logical structure of the argument is good. The argument is set up such that if the premises are true, then we would be justified in believing that the conclusion is true as well. In other words, the premises of the argument support the conclusion. So far, so good. But what about the evidential question? What do we think about the premises? When asking the inferential question, we simply assumed that the premises were true. But are the premises actually true? Well, let's consider each premise separately, and let's start with the first premise, P1. This premise tells us that it's a good decision to purchase cars that run great, get great gas mileage, have the latest safety features, and are reasonably priced. This seems like sound advice to me. This is not to say that in some cases someone couldn't have a good reason to ignore one or more of these characteristics, but overall P1 seems pretty unobjectionable. So then, what about P2? The second premise tells us that Sleazy Sally's car has all these desirable characteristics. Now, given the picture shown previously, I personally would find this very hard to believe. Not only do I think that Sleazy Sally's car doesn't run great, I have serious doubts about whether it runs at all. Is the car reasonably priced? Well, I don't know what Sally is charging for this car, but I would have to think that the reasonable price for a car that doesn't run would have to be pretty low. Maybe a reasonable price would be Sally paying me to take it off her hands. So, given the condition the car appears to be in, I would be very comfortable concluding that P2 of the argument is false. Sadly, but perhaps not all too surprisingly, Sleazy Sally does seem to be lying to us. So, what does this mean? When we ask the evidential question, we see that there is a serious problem with Sleazy Sally's argument. The underlying logical structure of the argument is fine. We already saw that previously when we asked the inferential question. The argument makes a good inference, but the evidence it uses is poor. Specifically, one of the crucial premises of the argument is false. Therefore, the argument Sleazy Sally makes here is not a good one. The general lesson to take from this example is the following. There is a difference between evaluating the structure of an argument and evaluating whether it employs true premises. Furthermore, an argument can be properly structured but still be a bad argument because it attempts to base its conclusion upon false premises. And in fact, this is precisely the situation that we see with the current example. The inference that Sleazy Sally makes is good, but it is very hard to believe that all the premises of her argument are in fact true. As such, Sleazy Sally's argument is a perfect example of the difference between asking the inferential question and asking the evidential question. Now that we understand the general difference between evaluating the inference of an argument and evaluating its premises, we need to get more specific. What precisely does it mean for an argument to make a good inference? What precisely does it mean for an argument to have good evidence? We will begin by clarifying the inferential question. The first thing to say here is that whether the premises of an argument support the conclusion actually depends upon the type of argument we are talking about. Some arguments only aim at showing that the conclusion of the argument is probable, or that it is most likely true. Other kinds of argument intend to show that the conclusion of the argument is necessarily true, that it must be true. In this class, we will be concerned with the latter kind of argument, which is known as a deductive argument. And the reason for this is because these arguments are the type of argument most commonly used in philosophy. So, when determining whether the inference of a deductive argument is good or not, we are asking whether the argument is valid or whether the argument is invalid. Here I have listed two different definitions of validity. Both of these are just different ways of saying the same thing, but some students will find one or the other definition easier to understand, so I have included both. Now, before I explain these definitions, I should warn you that the concept of validity will likely seem very abstract and potentially difficult to grasp at first merely from hearing the definition. However, we will go through many different examples of valid and invalid arguments in the latter portions of this video, and hopefully that should help to clarify the concept of validity. Okay, so let's take a look at the two definitions of validity that I have provided. Definition 1. An argument is valid if it is impossible for the premises of the argument to be true and for the conclusion to be false. A valid argument is one in which if we assume that the premises are true, it would not be possible for the conclusion to be false. And importantly, if an argument is valid, then we know it makes a good inference from the premises to the conclusion. The reason for this is because if it really is impossible for the conclusion of the argument to be false while the premises are all true, then there must be something about the underlying logical structure of the premises that makes it so the conclusion cannot be false. Now, we can also define validity in a second way. Let's look at definition 2. A valid argument is an argument in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Again, if the truth of the premises really does guarantee the truth of the conclusion, then there must not be a problem with the underlying logical structure of the argument. The inference the argument attempts to make must be a good one. When is an argument invalid? When do we say that the argument makes a poor inference or is improperly structured? Essentially, an argument is invalid in precisely the opposite circumstances that make an argument valid. An argument is invalid if it is possible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. Or an argument is invalid if the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. To make the notion of validity more concrete, let's look at some specific examples. First, consider argument 1. Premise 1. If every student receives an A on the exam, then the entire class will be happy. Premise 2. Every student received an A on the exam. Conclusion. The entire class will be happy. Now, is this argument valid or invalid? When answering this question, the first step is simply to assume that all the premises are true. That is, we assume that getting an A on the exam would be enough to make the entire class happy. We also assume that all the students in the class received an A on the exam. Now, it is critically important that when determining whether an argument is valid, that you do not attempt to evaluate whether the premises are true. Don't ask yourself whether getting an A is really all it takes to make a class happy. Don't start wondering whether it is reasonable to think that every student in the class received an A on the exam. These are questions we ask when considering the evidential question. These are questions we ask when we're thinking about whether the argument is sound. But right now, we're just asking whether the argument is valid. So, simply assume that all the premises of the argument are true, no matter how few or how many there are, or no matter how odd or weird the premises sound to you. simply assume that all the premises are true. So, given these assumptions, given the assumption that both premises in the argument are true, we then ask, is it possible for the conclusion to be false? If we assume that getting an A on the exam will make the entire class happy, and if we assume that every student received an A, then would it be possible for the entire class to not be happy? And in this case, we should see that it would not be possible. The first premise tells us that receiving an A on the exam is enough to make the whole class happy. The second premise affirms that, in fact, the entire class did receive an A on the exam. So from this, it necessarily follows that the entire class will be happy. This means that what you're looking at is a valid argument. Its underlying logical structure is valid such that it is impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. Now let's consider a second example, argument 2. Premise 1. If every student receives an A on the exam, then the entire class will be happy. Premise 2. The entire class is happy. Therefore, conclusion, every student received an A on the exam. Now, argument 2 is very similar to argument 1. In fact, premise 1 of both arguments is identical. However, argument 2 attempts to draw the conclusion that everyone received an A from the fact that the entire class is happy. Now, is this a valid argument? Once again, we start by assuming that both premises of the argument are true. We assume that getting an A on the exam would be enough to make every student happy. We also assume that the entire class is in fact happy. Now, do these two assumptions guarantee the truth of the conclusion? Is it still possible that not every student received an A, even if we assume that the claims made by both premises are true? In this case, the answer is yes. It is still possible that the conclusion is false, even if we assume that P1 is true and we assume that P2 is true. Based on the premises, we know that if every student receives an A on the exam, then all the students will be happy. Thus, we know that getting an A on the exam is one way to ensure the happiness of all the students. However, that does not mean it's the only way in which all the students might be made happy. Perhaps everyone in the class actually failed the exam, but the local sports team won the championship, and that was still enough to put a smile on everyone's face. Or perhaps the fact that the school year is coming to an end has given the students plenty of reason for joy, no matter how they do on the exam. To put the point another way, P1 of the argument tells us that happiness will be the consequence of the entire class getting an A on the exam. But it does not tell us that the happiness of the students is uniquely dependent on getting an A on the exam. However, this is precisely the inference that argument 2 attempts to make. Argument 2 assumes that the only way the students can be happy is if they get an A on the exam, but nothing in the argument actually implies that. So, it is in this case possible for both premises to be true and for the conclusion to still be false. This means the underlying logical inference the argument makes is a bad one, and thus the argument is invalid. Hopefully these examples have helped to clarify the notion of validity for you, but if you are still having some difficulty with this concept, I will be going through many more examples at the end of this video where we look at an argument and determine whether it's valid or invalid. However, before doing that, we need to give a more precise explanation of the standard we use when answering the evidential question. As we have already seen with Sleazy Sally's attempt to convince us to buy an automobile of questionable quality, an argument can make a good inference. It can have a good underlying logical structure without being a good argument, all things considered. This means that validity is necessary for being a good argument, but it is not sufficient. It is not enough. In order for an argument to be good, all things considered, In order for an argument to provide a rational demonstration that a conclusion is true that should be convincing, that argument must also be sound. But what does it mean for an argument to be sound? The definition of soundness is relatively straightforward. A sound argument is an argument that is both valid and has all true premises. By contrast, an argument will be unsound if it is either invalid or has at least one false premise, or if not all the premises are true. Given this definition, we can see why soundness is the gold standard for arguments. We can see why it would be the case that if an argument is sound, then we would be rationally obligated to believe its conclusion is true. Now, why is this? Well, a sound argument is valid, so it must have a proper underlying logical structure. At the same time, all its premises are true, so the evidence it uses is correct and reliable as well. But if the structure of the argument is good, and the evidence the argument uses is good, then what grounds will there be to criticize the argument? It doesn't seem that there would be any such grounds. So, in philosophy, the goal is to make sound arguments that provide answers to philosophical questions. Let's consider two more example arguments. First, consider argument 3. Premise 1. If the state of Ohio is part of the United States, then the city of Cincinnati is also part of the United States. Premise 2. The state of Ohio is part of the United States. Conclusion. Cincinnati is part of the United States. To determine whether this argument is sound, we first need to ask, is the argument valid? Here we should notice that if we assume that Ohio being part of the U.S. implies that the city of Cincinnati must be part of the U.S., and if we assume that Ohio is part of the U.S., then it necessarily follows that the city of Cincinnati will be part of the United States. This means that argument 3 is in fact a valid argument. But is it sound? This requires that both of the argument's premises are in fact true. So now we're going to stop merely assuming that the premises are true, and we're going to ask, are these premises really correct? Well, P1 is true. Cincinnati is a city that is contained within the jurisdiction of the state of Ohio. So, if Ohio is part of the United States, then Cincinnati will be part of the United States as well. This means that P1 is in fact correct. What about P2? It is also the case that the state of Ohio is part of the United States. That means P2 is true as well. This means we are looking at a sound argument. The logical structure is valid, and all the premises are true. This is an argument that gives us, therefore, a decisive reason to accept its conclusion as true. Now let's consider argument 4. Premise 1. If the nation of France is part of the United States, then the city of Paris is also part of the United States. P2. The nation of France is part of the United States. Conclusion. The city of Paris is part of the United States. So first, is the argument valid? In this case, it is. In fact, it has the same exact logical structure, although not the same content, as valid arguments 1 and 3. If France being part of the United States means that Paris must be part of the United States, and if France is in fact part of the United States, then it would follow that Paris must be part of the United States. This is valid reasoning. But is the argument sound? Are the premises true? Well, first, let's look at P1. We might be tempted to say that P1 is false because, of course, in the real world, France is not part of the United States. However, that is not what P1 is saying. P1 is simply saying that if France were part of the United States, then the city of Paris would be part of the United States as well. And that is a true statement. To see this, just imagine the following. Let's say the United States conquers France, or France agrees to become the 51st state in the Union. Now, if that happened, then Paris would indeed be part of the United States. So this means that premise 1 is true. As is so often the case in logic, the word if makes a great deal of difference to how we evaluate this statement. But what about P2? Now this is clearly false. In the real world, France is its own nation and is not part of the United States. So what does this mean? The argument is valid, but it is unsound. The logical structure of the argument is fine, but its second premise is false. This means we do not have good reason to accept the argument's conclusion, which is also clearly false. This argument provides yet another example of how validity is necessary but not sufficient for a good argument. Proper reasoning is important, but if the argument's premises are false, if they're not true, then it will not achieve its goal of providing rationally compelling support for its conclusion. Let's apply what we have learned thus far to another argument. This argument is actually one that we examined in the previous video. Argument 5 states, Premise 1, it only makes sense to hold someone responsible for their actions if that person has free will. P2, no human person has free will. Conclusion, it doesn't make sense to hold any person responsible for their actions. Is this a sound argument? Well, let's begin by evaluating its validity. P1 tells us that the only scenario under which it would be fair to hold someone responsible for what they do is if that person has free will. This implies that it would not make sense to hold anyone who lacks free will responsible for what they do. Then, P2 tells us that nobody has free will. Every human person lacks free will. The direct conclusion to draw from this is precisely the one that is in fact drawn by the argument. It doesn't make any sense to hold anyone responsible for their actions. So, this means that the argument is valid. Now, before we ask whether this argument is sound, consider the following question. Would it be reasonable for you to expect another person who is fully educated about the concept of validity to agree with the judgment that this is a valid argument? It seems it would be reasonable. There are some special cases where the validity of an argument is not so clear, but by and large, determining validity is a technical skill that involves understanding how premises lead to a conclusion and how inference works. Because of this, there's usually going to be a reasonable expectation that people will agree about whether an argument is valid or invalid. However, the same cannot be said of soundness, and this argument provides a clear example of this point. Let's take each premise separately. First, is P1 true? Well, it is common to believe that only those who are free to make their own decisions should be held fully responsible. This is why children do not get punished the same way as an adult when they do something wrong. It is also why we do not think someone who accidentally trips, falls, and hurts another person is as blameworthy as someone who intentionally and deliberately makes the choice to physically assault someone. At the same time, there do seem to be other cases where we hold people responsible even when that responsibility does not issue from their free choice. One clear example of this is in the life of the family. We typically think that we have special obligations to our parents and siblings, and we blame people who fail to uphold those obligations, even though we did not choose to be born into this world with the attachments to those specific individuals. Ultimately, it seems more debate and thought would be needed to determine whether P1 is true, and it would be likely that different people would come to different conclusions on this question. So what about P2? Now, there is a great deal of disagreement about this premise. The question of free will has been discussed by philosophers for 2,000 years, and the debate rages on to this day. There are many different positions and opinions on the question of free will, with no real clear consensus behind any of them. Thus, it is still not clear whether we can say definitively that P2 is true or false. Does this mean that there is no truth about the nature of responsibility or the existence of free will? No, it doesn't mean this. Neither does it mean that it is pointless to discuss these questions. It just means that these are difficult philosophical issues that can only be resolved through further thinking and which are likely to generate significant disagreement even among professionally trained philosophers. Some philosophers are convinced that argument 5 is sound, others are convinced that argument 5 is unsound. The main point to take away from this for our purposes, however, is that unlike determining validity, which is a much more technical matter, we will not always be in a position to say with complete confidence that an argument is sound or unsound. Now that we have explained the concept of validity and how to determine if an argument is valid or invalid, I'm going to cover some additional practice exercises to reinforce this material. What I would recommend you do now is pause this video and go to the description section where you will find a link to a document with the practice exercises that I'm going to cover. What these exercises will require you to do is determine whether each argument presented is valid or invalid. Give each of those exercises an attempt, and then when you are finished, restart the video and I will explain the correct answers. I consider arguments 6 through 15 to be of a basic difficulty level, while arguments 16 through 19 are more advanced. In addition, if you feel you do not need to watch my explanation for every exercise, then in the description section of this video, you will find timestamps that will take you to each of the individual exercises so you can go directly to the problems you are having difficulty with if that is what you would like to do. Argument 6 reads, Premise 1, Ryan is going to buy a lottery ticket on Wednesday, and Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. Conclusion, Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. One thing you will notice here is that for each of these exercises, I have represented the bare bones logical structure of the argument by taking out the specific statements and replacing them with capital letters. In this case, I have replaced Ryan is going to buy a lottery ticket on Wednesday with L, and I have replaced Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday with S. Since validity is really just a matter of evaluating the underlying logical structure of an argument, this can sometimes be helpful when determining if an argument is valid or invalid. In this particular case, we can see that argument 6 is valid. P1 tells us both that L is true and that S is true. So if that is the case, then we know that each of those statements individually must be true as well. Therefore, we are able to conclude that just S by itself is true. So, this is an instance of valid reasoning. Argument 7 reads, Premise 1, Ryan is going to buy a lottery ticket on Wednesday, or Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. Conclusion, Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. This argument is the exact same as argument 6, except the word and in premise 1 has now been replaced with the word or. This might seem like a minor difference, but it matters a great deal in logic. If we know that L and S are true, then we can conclude that either of those statements is true. However, if we only know that L or S is true, then we know that at least one of the statements is true, but we do not know which one of the statements is true. Therefore, we cannot yet conclude that S is true. We cannot yet conclude that Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. Argument 8 reads, Premise 1, Ryan is either going to buy a lottery ticket on Wednesday, or Ryan is going to the store on Wednesday. Premise 2, Ryan is not going to the store on Wednesday. Conclusion, Ryan is going to buy a lottery ticket on Wednesday. This is a valid argument. Just like argument 7, we are presented with two options, L or S. However, unlike argument 7, P2 of argument 8 tells us that one of these options is not true. Specifically, it tells us that S is not true. Since we know that at least one of the options presented in P1 must be true, the fact that we now know that one of those options is false means that the other option must be correct. It must be true. Because we know that Ryan is not going to the store, we can validly conclude that he is going to buy a lottery ticket. So, this is a valid argument. Argument 9 reads, Premise 1. Ryan is either going to eat at Subway, eat at McDonald's, or he will starve to death. P2. Ryan is not going to eat at Subway. Conclusion. Ryan is going to starve to death. Luckily for Ryan, this is an invalid argument. The first premise of this argument is also an or statement, but this time we are presented with 3 different options. Ryan eats at Subway, he eats at McDonald's, or he succumbs to starvation. Premise 2 eliminates the possibility that Ryan eats at Subway, so that leaves us with 2 options, McDonald's or starvation. At this point, the argument concludes that Ryan is going to starve. However, that is a premature conclusion. There is still the possibility that Ryan staves off starvation by going to McDonald's. Therefore, this is an invalid argument. It is impossible to get all the way to the conclusion with just the information given to us in the premises. Argument 10 reads, Premise 1. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Premise 2. Ryan lost money. Conclusion. Ryan played the lottery. This argument is invalid. Premise 1 of the argument presents us with an if-then statement. It tells us that a consequence of Ryan playing the lottery will be that Ryan loses money. Now we know from this that playing the lottery will result in Ryan losing money, but importantly, Premise 1 does not tell us that playing the lottery is the only way in which Ryan will lose money. Even if P1 is true, there are many other ways in which Ryan might also lose money. What does the argument conclude then from this if-then statement in P1? The argument concludes that because, as stated in P2, Ryan lost money, therefore, the conclusion, Ryan must have played the lottery. However, as I just suggested, this is not a valid inference. Ryan could have lost the money in many other ways even if he never bought a lottery ticket in his life. For example, perhaps the stock market took a downturn and Ryan lost money that way. Maybe Ryan was robbed on the sidewalk. There are many other possibilities as well. So, even if P1 and P2 are true, we cannot conclude that the conclusion is true as well. We should notice here that this argument has precisely the same logical structure as the invalid argument 2 that we discussed prior. In fact, any argument that has this structure will be invalid, regardless of its specific content. As we will see in our next video, this is actually one of the most common forms of invalid argument that is often mistaken for good reasoning. But we will have more time to discuss that later on. Argument 11 reads, Premise 1. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Premise 2. Ryan played the lottery. Conclusion, Ryan will lose money. This argument is valid. P1 of this argument uses the same if-then statement as argument 10. However, in this case, the correct inference is made. Given P1, if we know, as stated in P2, that Ryan played the lottery, then we will conclude that he will lose money. Premise 1 tells us that losing money will be a consequence of Ryan playing the lottery. Therefore, if we know that Ryan played the lottery, we also know that Ryan will lose money. You will again notice that this argument has exactly the same structure as the valid argument 1 we looked at previously. At this point, it might also be useful to pause and say one additional thing. You might look at this argument and say, this argument must be invalid because P1 is false. Sure, the vast majority of the time, people who play the lottery win nothing and lose the money they spent on their lottery ticket, but that is not always the case. After all, somebody has to win. So, maybe Ryan will win money, and that means P1 is false. Now, perhaps that is true, but remember what we are doing when evaluating whether an argument is valid. We are only evaluating its logical structure. We are not evaluating whether the premises are true. The question of whether the premises are true, again, is relevant to the soundness of the argument. But when determining if an argument is valid or invalid, we simply assume the premises are true and then see if the conclusion follows from those premises. Argument 12 reads, Premise 1, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Premise 2, Ryan did not play the lottery. Conclusion, Ryan will not lose money. This is an invalid argument. Again, the first premise tells us that Ryan playing the lottery will have the consequence of him losing money. However, once again, it is important to emphasize that this is not the only way in which Ryan might lose money. As stated previously, Ryan could lose money by getting robbed or suffering the misfortune of a stock market downturn. With this in mind, let's look at P2 and the conclusion. P2 tells us that Ryan did not play the lottery, and from this it is inferred that Ryan did not lose money. But from what we just stated, this does not follow precisely because there are many other ways in which Ryan might lose money that have nothing to do with the lottery, even if playing the lottery is one guaranteed way of losing money. Consequently, this is simply invalid reasoning. And as we will see in the next video, this is also a very common form of invalid and fallacious argument that unfortunately often succeeds in being convincing. Argument 13 reads, Premise 1, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Premise 2, Ryan did not lose money. Conclusion, Ryan did not play the lottery. This is a valid argument. Once again, Premise 1 establishes the if-then claim that Ryan playing the lottery means that Ryan will lose money. Now, what inference is drawn from that statement in this case? Premise 2 establishes that Ryan did not lose money. Now think about what this means. It means that the consequence that it was claimed would follow from Ryan playing the lottery did not occur. We were told that if Ryan played the lottery, he would lose money. And now we're also told that Ryan has not lost any money. What should we conclude from this? We should conclude that in fact Ryan did not play the lottery, which is exactly what is claimed in the conclusion of the argument. If we are told that some statement L being true means that some statement M will also be true, but as it turns out M is not true, then it must be the case that L is not true. So, this is a valid argument. And in fact, this is a common form of valid reasoning that is used in many philosophical arguments. As such, it is also a form of argument that we will take a closer look at in our next video. Argument 14 reads, Premise 1, if David wins the lottery, then Ryan will be in an average mood. Premise 2, if Rachel wins the lottery, then Ryan will also be in an average mood. Conclusion, Ryan will be in an average mood. This is an invalid argument. Here we have two if-then statements that draw out the consequence of different people winning the lottery. The first premise tells us that David winning the lottery will put Ryan in an average mood, and the second premise tells us that Rachel winning the lottery will also put Ryan in the average mood. The conclusion drawn from this is that Ryan, in fact, will be in an average mood. This would be a valid inference if we knew that either David or Rachel were going to win the lottery. But as we look at the premises, we do not know this from the information that is given. For example, many other things are possible. Perhaps Ryan's worst enemy will win the lottery, and that means Ryan will be furious. Or maybe Ryan himself will win the lottery, and then he will be ecstatic. In any case, the premises of the argument do not tell us who will win the lottery, so we cannot draw the conclusion the argument wants to draw. As a consequence, this argument is invalid. Argument 15 reads, Premise 1, if David wins the lottery, then Ryan will be in an average mood. Premise 2, if Rachel wins the lottery, then Ryan will also be in an average mood. Premise 3, either David or Rachel will win the lottery. Conclusion, Ryan will be in an average mood. This is a valid argument. Notice that this argument is nearly identical to argument 14. We are told that David winning the lottery will put Ryan in an average mood. We are told that Rachel winning the lottery will have the exact same result. And the conclusion is drawn that this result will occur, namely, Ryan will in fact be in an average mood. However, there is one very important difference here. An additional premise, P3, has been added, which tells us that either David or Rachel will win the lottery. Now, we still do not know which particular individual will win the lottery, but we do know that it is going to be either David or Rachel. Furthermore, because either of these possibilities lead to the exact same consequence, Ryan being in an average mood, we have enough information to draw the conclusion that Ryan will be in an average mood. We may not know exactly who will win the lottery, but we do know that no matter who wins among the possible candidates for lottery winner, Ryan's reaction will be the same. He will be in an average mood. Consequently, this argument has a valid inference. Argument 16 reads the following. Premise 1. If Ryan wins the lottery, then he will buy a fancy car. Premise 2. If Ryan buys a fancy car, then Ryan will get a speeding ticket. Premise 3. If Ryan gets a speeding ticket, then his entire life will fall apart and be in shambles. So we conclude that if Ryan wins the lottery, then his entire life will fall apart and be in shambles. Now, argument 16 is valid. The argument presents us with three if-then statements in which the then part of one statement is the same as the if portion of the next statement. We see that Ryan winning the lottery means that Ryan will buy a fancy car, and Ryan buying a fancy car means that Ryan will get a speeding ticket. Furthermore, it is claimed that Ryan getting a speeding ticket means that his entire life will fall apart. So each of the premises of the argument forms a continuous chain. That means that if the first step in the chain occurs, that is, Ryan winning the lottery, then we know that the last step will eventually occur as well. Ryan's life will fall apart. And we see this is precisely the conclusion that the argument draws. The argument concludes that if Ryan wins the lottery, then eventually his life will fall apart. So as such, this argument is valid. Argument 17 reads, Premise 1. Human beings either have free will or human beings do not have free will. Premise 2. If human beings have free will, then human beings are responsible for what they do. Premise 3. If human beings do not have free will, then human beings are not responsible for what they do. Conclusion. Human beings are not responsible for what they do. This argument is invalid. P1 presents us with two different options. Either human beings have free will or they do not. And P2 and P3 each draw out the consequences of these options. If human beings have free will, then we are told they are responsible for their actions. And if they don't have free will, then we're told that human beings are not responsible. Now, the argument attempts to draw the conclusion that human beings are not responsible for what they do. And it is true that this is one of the possible consequences from the options we have been presented. Specifically, it is the consequence of human beings not having free will. However, the premises do not establish that, in fact, human beings lack free will. This is just presented as one possible option. Now, because the two options presented in P1 do not both lead to the same result or to the same consequence, we do not yet have sufficient information to conclude that one of these consequences in particular is true. We do know that one of them must be true, but we cannot yet establish which one that is. Therefore, this is an invalid argument. Argument 18 reads, Premise 1. There is evil in the world. Premise 2. If there is evil in the world, then God is either not omnibenevolent, not omniscient, or not omnipotent. Premise 3, God is omniscient. Conclusion, therefore, God is not omnibenevolent. Now this is a more complex argument, so in my explanation, I'm going to focus on the outline of its underlying logical structure. This argument is invalid. Now, with more complex arguments like this, it can be helpful to try to see if we can reach the conclusion through some intermediate steps or intermediate inferences. To see what I mean, reference the outline of argument 18's logical structure. Are there any inferences we can make that might get us closer to the argument's final conclusion? Well, take a look at P1 and P2. P2 says that if E is true, then it follows that either B, K, or P is false. That means at least one of those statements must be false. Furthermore, P1 tells us that E is in fact true. So from these two statements, premise 1 and premise 2, it follows that either B, K, or P is false. This is one inference we can make. So let's make that an intermediate conclusion of the argument, and let's call that C1. Perhaps we can use this. Perhaps this will help us get closer to the final conclusion of the argument that B is false, or in other words, not B. While the inference we just made does let us move closer to the final conclusion, unfortunately we cannot get all the way there. Take a look at C1 and P3. From the inference we just made, which we labeled as C1, we know that either B, K, or P must be false. Now, P3 tells us that K is true, so K cannot be the false statement. That means we can conclude that either B or P must be false. Those are the only two remaining options for which statement is not true. However, the argument concludes directly from this that B must be the false statement. Yet, since it is still possible that P could be false, this is a premature step. For this argument to be valid, we would need an additional premise that actually claims that P is true. However, because no such premise exists in this argument, this would be invalid reasoning. Argument 19 reads, Premise 1. If natural objects are the product of intelligent design, then God exists. Premise 2. Natural objects are either the product of intelligent design or they came into existence spontaneously. Premise 3. Natural objects did not come into existence spontaneously. Therefore, the conclusion is that God exists. Again, this is a more complex argument, so once again in my explanation, I'm going to focus on the outline of its underlying logical structure. Just like with argument 18, we are going to see if we can proceed in a step-by-step fashion, making inferences that will lead us to the final conclusion of the argument. So, are there any inferences we can make? There are. Look at P2 and P3. If we know that either D or S must be true, and we know that S is false, then that means D must necessarily be true, essentially by a process of elimination. So, we can infer as an intermediate conclusion that D is true. Now, can we get all the way to the final conclusion of G? The final conclusion that God exists? In fact, we can. Notice P1 and C1, our new intermediate conclusion. P1 tells us that if D is true, then G must be true. And luckily for us, we have just established that D is true with our previous inference. So, this means that we can validly infer G. We can validly infer that God exists. And of course, that is precisely what is stated in the final conclusion of the argument. Therefore, we can conclude that this argument is in fact valid.